Over the English Channel, June 26, 1943. A solitary Republic P-47 Thunderbolt limped through hostile skies, trailing smoke and leaking fluids into the wind. Inside the shattered cockpit, Second Lieutenant Robert Samuel Johnson could barely see through the hydraulic fluid coating his windscreen. His canopy was jammed, his instruments destroyed, and cannon fire had left him partially blind and bleeding. Behind him, somewhere in the grey expanse between France and England, 16 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters had turned a routine bomber escort into a nightmare. The young pilot from Lawton, Oklahoma had every reason to believe these would be his final moments. His fighter had absorbed damage that should have torn it from the sky. Fire had consumed his cockpit. His aircraft had spun earthward in a death spiral. He had tried to bail out, only to find himself trapped when his parachute snagged on the damaged canopy frame. Now, as he struggled to maintain consciousness and keep his crippled warbird airborne, Johnson represented something larger than one man's desperate fight for survival. He embodied a question that would define aerial combat in the Second World War. Just how much punishment could an aircraft endure before physics and fate conspired to bring it down? The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was never meant to be graceful. Weighing over 7 tons fully loaded, this behemoth dwarfed every other single-seat fighter in the sky. American pilots called it the Jug, a reference to its portly profile that resembled a milk jug standing on its nose. German pilots had other names for it, none of them complimentary. Yet, for all its ungainly appearance, the Thunderbolt possessed qualities that would prove invaluable in the crucible of combat. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine generated over 2,000 horsepower. 850 caliber machine guns bristled from its wings, capable of delivering more firepower than any other American fighter. And its construction, rugged almost to a fault, gave it a reputation for bringing pilots home when lesser aircraft would have disintegrated. On this summer afternoon in 1943, that reputation would face its most severe examination. The 8th Air Force was still learning hard lessons over occupied Europe. The vaunted daylight bombing campaign, conceived in peacetime confidence, was proving far more costly than pre-war planners had imagined. German fighter defenses were sophisticated, aggressive, and utterly lethal. American bomber crews spoke of the gauntlet they ran every time they crossed into enemy airspace. Fighters swarmed like angry hornets, attacking from every angle, exploiting every weakness. The need for long-range fighter escorts was desperate and growing more critical with each mission. The 56th Fighter Group, Johnson's unit, had arrived in England earlier that year with high hopes and untested tactics. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, was a no-nonsense leader who understood that the European theater would forgive no mistakes. He had trained his pilots relentlessly, drilling into them the importance of teamwork, discipline, and maintaining formation integrity. For the aggressive young pilots under his command, these lessons sometimes chafed. Robert Johnson was among those who struggled with the rigid requirements of formation flying. His superiors worried that his tendency toward independence might prove fatal in combat. Some doubted he would survive his first encounters with the Luftwaffe. The mission on June 26 should have been straightforward. 48 Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group launched from their advanced base at RAF Manston in the late afternoon. Their task was to meet returning Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses that had bombed Villacoublay airfield in the Paris suburbs. The bombers had already run a deadly gauntlet through German defenses. Now they needed protection for their vulnerable journey home. The Thunderbolt pilots climbed to altitude and set course for the rendezvous point near Forges-les-Eaux in northern France. Johnson flew in the rear of his squadron's formation, a position that offered both advantages and vulnerabilities. He could watch for threats from behind, but he was also the most exposed to attack. As the formation approached the rendezvous coordinates, Johnson's mind was focused on maintaining his position and scanning the sky for both friendly bombers and enemy fighters. The afternoon sun created challenging visibility conditions, with scattered clouds offering concealment for friend and foe alike. What happened next unfolded with brutal suddenness. 16 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters from Jägerschwader 26 dove out of the sun, attacking from above and behind with devastating precision. These were not novice pilots. They were veterans of the Channel front, experienced hunters who knew exactly how to exploit the split second of surprise before their targets could react. The initial pass scattered the American formation like leaves in a gale. Thunderbolts broke in every direction, each pilot suddenly fighting his own desperate battle for survival. Robert Johnson never saw the fighter that hit him. 20mm cannon shells slammed into his aircraft with shocking violence, each impact like a sledgehammer blow. His canopy exploded in a shower of glass fragments. One shell grazed his nose, drawing blood. Another destroyed his instrument panel in a cascade of sparks and smoke. The hydraulic system ruptured, spraying pressurized fluid throughout the cockpit. Fire erupted somewhere in the engine compartment, and within seconds, smoke filled the cockpit so completely that Johnson could no longer see his instruments, his wings, or anything beyond the orange glow of flames. The Thunderbolt snapped into a violent spin, tumbling earthward in a rotation Johnson could not control. The G-forces pressed him into his seat with crushing weight. His training screamed at him to bail out, to abandon the aircraft before it became his coffin. With desperate strength, he reached for the canopy release. It moved 6 inches and stopped, jammed by battle damage. He pulled again, using both hands, straining with everything he had. The canopy would not budge. Trapped in a burning, spinning aircraft at 20,000 feet, Robert Johnson confronted the possibility that he would die in the sky over France, his body forever lost in the wreckage of his fighter. But the Thunderbolt, massive and overbuilt, refused to give up. And neither did its pilot. Through sheer force of will and the muscle memory of countless training flights, Johnson stomped on the left rudder pedal and hauled back on the control stick. The spinning slowed. The nose came up. Miraculously, impossibly, the fire went out, starved of oxygen or choked by the rush of wind through the shattered fuselage. Johnson found himself still alive, still flying, though barely conscious, and flying an aircraft that by all rights should have been scattered across the French countryside. The engagement that had ambushed the 56th Fighter Group would claim 5 Thunderbolts that afternoon. 4 pilots would die. A 5th would bail out over the English Channel and be rescued by air-sea rescue. The Germans would lose aircraft as well, though exact numbers remain disputed. But for Robert Johnson, the ordeal was far from over. He was alone, wounded, half-blind, flying a crippled aircraft that leaked precious fluids with every passing second. Between him and safety lay the English Channel and whatever German fighters still prowled these skies. His nightmare was about to enter its second, even more harrowing phase. To understand how Robert Johnson survived what should have been an unsurvivable encounter, one must first understand the machine he flew and the men who designed it. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was born not from elegant aerodynamic theory, but from brutal practicality and the urgent demands of a world at war. In the spring of 1940, as German forces overran Western Europe with shocking speed, American military planners recognized that the fighter aircraft in their inventory were hopelessly outmatched. The Seversky Aircraft Corporation, soon to be reorganized as Republic Aviation, had been working on fighter designs that showed promise but lacked the performance necessary to compete with the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the emerging Focke-Wulf 190. The company's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, understood that incremental improvements would not be sufficient. What was needed was a radical rethinking of the American fighter concept. Kartveli was a Georgian immigrant with an engineering background and an intuitive grasp of what made aircraft succeed in combat. He had watched the air war over Europe develop through intelligence reports and technical assessments. The lessons were clear: fighters needed speed, firepower, altitude performance, and above all, they needed to bring their pilots home. Elegance could be sacrificed. Weight could be tolerated. But the fundamental capabilities had to be there, or the aircraft would be a death trap for the men who flew it. The breakthrough came with the decision to build the fighter around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. This was not a small, compact power plant. It was an 18-cylinder, twin-row radial engine that produced over 2,000 horsepower. To harness that power at high altitudes where bomber escorts would be required, Kartveli added a turbo supercharger, a complex piece of machinery that forced compressed air into the engine to compensate for the thin atmosphere above 30,000 feet. The turbocharger was housed in the belly of the aircraft, connected to the engine by ducting that had to be carefully designed to avoid excessive heat and pressure losses. The result was an aircraft like nothing that had come before. When the first XP-47B prototype rolled out in 1941, it weighed nearly 13,000 pounds empty. Fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and pilot, the weight climbed to over 17,000 pounds. For comparison, the Supermarine Spitfire, Britain's celebrated fighter, weighed less than 6,000 pounds loaded. The Thunderbolt was nearly 3 times as heavy. Some observers questioned whether such a massive machine could even qualify as a fighter. Republic's engineers called it a dinosaur, but added that it would be a dinosaur with good proportions. The size brought advantages that would prove critical in combat. The Thunderbolt's cockpit was spacious and well protected. An inch-thick armor plate stood behind the pilot's seat, capable of stopping rifle-caliber machine gun rounds and even deflecting some cannon fire. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, using a rubber compound that would swell when punctured by bullets, closing the holes before too much fuel leaked out. The radial engine, with its cylinders arranged in a circle around the crankshaft, could lose one or even several cylinders to battle damage and keep running. Liquid-cooled engines, by contrast, could be disabled by a single bullet through the coolant system. But the Thunderbolt's greatest virtue was one that could not be easily quantified in specifications or performance charts. It was tough. The airframe was built with heavy internal structure, thick aluminum skin, and redundant systems. Control cables were armored. Critical components had backups. The aircraft was designed, consciously or not, to absorb punishment and keep flying. This quality would earn it a reputation that spread through fighter squadrons on every front where it served. Production began in March 1942 at Republic's facility in Farmingdale, Long Island. The first aircraft off the line went to testing and training units in the United States. Teething problems emerged immediately. The enormous engine generated vibration that cracked components. The turbocharger's complexity led to maintenance difficulties. The aircraft's initial rate of climb was disappointing, a critical flaw for a fighter expected to intercept high-altitude bombers. Republic's engineers worked frantically to address these issues, introducing modifications almost monthly. The addition of paddle blade propellers in late 1942 significantly improved climb performance. Radio problems were resolved with British equipment. The landing gear was strengthened after several training accidents revealed structural weaknesses. By late 1942, the Thunderbolt was deemed ready for combat deployment. The 56th Fighter Group, training at various bases in the northeastern United States, was selected as one of the first units to receive the new fighter. The pilots who would fly it into combat were a mix of eager volunteers and recently commissioned officers, most of them in their early 20s, none of them with combat experience. They came from small towns and big cities across America, united by a desire to fly and a willingness to fight. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, appointed to command the 56th in September 1942, faced the daunting task of transforming these novice pilots into an effective fighting force. Zemke was a rare commodity in the Army Air Forces at that time, a pilot with actual combat experience. He had served as an observer with the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain in 1940, watching British pilots fight for their survival against the Luftwaffe. He had seen what worked and what failed. He had witnessed the price paid for poor tactics and inadequate training. Zemke drilled his pilots relentlessly. He emphasized formation integrity, mutual support, and disciplined communications. He taught them to use the Thunderbolt's strengths and avoid tactics that played to its weaknesses. The P-47 could not turn with lighter German fighters in a traditional dogfight. It could, however, dive faster than anything in the sky. It could absorb damage that would destroy other aircraft. And its 8 machine guns, when properly aimed, could deliver devastating firepower. The training was not without cost. 18 pilots died in accidents during the 56th's workup period. 41 aircraft were lost. The Thunderbolt's size and weight demanded respect and skill. A pilot who misjudged his approach or stalled the aircraft at low altitude would have no second chance. Zemke worried constantly about his pilots, identifying those who showed promise and those who might not survive their first combat missions. Robert Samuel Johnson was among those who gave Zemke cause for concern. Born in February 1920, Johnson had grown up in Oklahoma during the Depression. His family struggled financially, but young Robert found escape and purpose in the sky. He witnessed an air show at nearby Fort Sill when he was 8 years old, and immediately decided he wanted to fly. He earned his private pilot's license the day before his 16th birthday, a remarkable achievement for a teenager in the 1930s. When the war began, Johnson enlisted immediately, drawn by a combination of patriotism and a deep desire to test himself in the ultimate arena. Johnson's flying skills were evident from the start. He had natural coordination and quick reflexes. But he also had an independent streak that worried his commanders. He had a tendency to break formation, to go after targets on his own, to pursue his own vision of how air combat should be fought. In peacetime, such qualities might be overlooked or even encouraged. In the unforgiving skies over occupied Europe, they could get a pilot killed, along with anyone depending on him for support. Zemke reprimanded Johnson more than once during training. He emphasized that fighter combat in 1943 was not about individual heroics. It was about teamwork, mutual support, and following a plan. A pilot who broke formation to chase a victory might get his kill, but he would leave his wingmen vulnerable. The Luftwaffe pilots were experts at exploiting such mistakes. They hunted in pairs and sections, covering each other, setting traps for the unwary. American pilots who forgot these lessons did not usually survive long enough to learn from their mistakes. On January 6, 1943, the 56th Fighter Group boarded the liner Queen Elizabeth and sailed for England. They arrived in Liverpool several days later and were assigned to bases in East Anglia, the region of England closest to occupied Europe. The proximity was necessary. Even the P-47, with its relatively large fuel capacity, had limited range. Escorting bombers deep into Germany would require drop tanks and careful fuel management. The initial missions would be shorter-range sweeps and escorts, designed to build experience and develop tactics. The first combat mission took place on April 13, 1943. It was a fighter sweep over France, intended as much to familiarize pilots with the operating environment as to engage the enemy. The mission was plagued by radio failures. American radios proved inadequate for the electromagnetic environment over Europe. British equipment was hastily installed in all aircraft. The second mission, on April 15, brought the first aerial victory when Major Donald Blakesley shot down a Focke-Wulf 190 near Dieppe. It also brought the harsh reality of combat. The Luftwaffe was skilled, aggressive, and utterly professional. The 56th would lose pilots and aircraft in the weeks that followed as the men learned their trade under fire. Robert Johnson scored his first kill on June 13, 1943, shooting down a Focke-Wulf 190 northwest of Ypres, Belgium. He had proven his skills, but his tendency toward aggressive independence remained. Just 13 days later, that characteristic would nearly cost him his life in an encounter that would become legendary in the annals of military aviation. The afternoon of June 26, 1943, began unremarkably for the pilots of the 56th Fighter Group. 48 P-47 Thunderbolts sat on the hardstands at RAF Manston, an advanced operating base on the southeastern coast of England. The base was closer to occupied France than the 56th's home station at Horsham St. Faith, reducing transit time and allowing more time over the combat zone. The mission briefing had outlined a straightforward task: fly to a designated point near Forges-les-Eaux in northern France, meet a formation of returning B-17 bombers, and escort them safely across the Channel to England. Robert Johnson listened to the briefing with the mixture of anticipation and dread that had become familiar to all combat pilots. Before every mission, he felt the cold touch of fear, a sensation he had learned to channel into heightened alertness rather than panic. He had made a resolution before this mission: he would stay in formation, follow orders, and fly as a disciplined member of his squadron. His previous tendency to break off on his own had earned him reprimands from Zemke and the other senior pilots. Today, he would prove he could be a team player. The Thunderbolts took off in the late afternoon, the thunder of 48 R2800 engines echoing across the Kent countryside. They formed up by squadron and set course across the Channel. The weather was typical for Northern Europe in summer: scattered clouds, hazy visibility, and occasional breaks of sunshine that created dramatic contrasts of light and shadow. Such conditions favored the defenders. German pilots could use the clouds for concealment, diving out of the sun to catch their opponents by surprise. The 61st Fighter Squadron, Johnson's unit, flew in formation with the other two squadrons of the group. Johnson held his assigned position near the rear of the formation. He continuously scanned the sky, checking his 6 o'clock position, sweeping his eyes across the horizon, looking for the telltale glint of sunlight on a canopy or the contrails that marked high-flying aircraft. The discipline of maintaining position while conducting visual search required constant attention. A moment's inattention could mean missing a critical threat. As the formation approached the rendezvous point, tension increased. This was where they expected to meet the bombers. It was also where the Luftwaffe often positioned fighters to intercept the returning American aircraft. The German controllers tracked Allied formations with remarkable precision, using radar and visual observers to vector their fighters to optimal intercept positions. The Luftwaffe pilots were not amateurs. Many of them were veterans with dozens or even hundreds of combat missions. They knew every trick, every tactic, every way to exploit an opponent's mistake. The attack came without warning. 16 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters from the second group of Jagdgeschwader 26, one of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings, dove from above and behind. They had been waiting at higher altitude, using the sun and clouds for concealment, watching the American formation with predatory patience. The German commander chose his moment perfectly, timing the attack for maximum surprise and disruption. The first pass was devastating. 20mm cannon fire and 13mm machine gun rounds tore into the American formation. The Thunderbolts scattered instantly, each pilot reacting to the sudden threat with instinctive evasion maneuvers. Formation integrity, so carefully maintained during the transit, disintegrated in seconds. Now it was 48 individual pilots fighting for their lives against 16 experienced predators. Johnson never saw the aircraft that hit him. One moment he was flying in formation, scanning the sky, maintaining his position. The next moment his world exploded in violence. Cannon shells ripped through his fuselage from tail to nose. Each impact was accompanied by a sound like a hammer striking metal, a sharp crack that penetrated even through his leather helmet. The shells were high-explosive incendiary rounds, designed not just to penetrate but to ignite and destroy. When they detonated inside his aircraft, they created a cascade of secondary damage that multiplied their destructive effect. The first indication Johnson had that he was under attack was the sudden disintegration of his canopy. The plexiglass exploded in a shower of fragments, some pieces flying away into the slipstream, others remaining as jagged shards in the frame. One cannon shell struck so close to his head that the shrapnel grazed his nose, drawing blood and momentarily stunning him. His instrument panel, a critical array of gauges and switches, disappeared in a shower of sparks and broken glass. Fire erupted somewhere forward, and within seconds the cockpit filled with dense black smoke. The hydraulic system, which powered the landing gear, flaps, and canopy, ruptured under the cannon fire. Hydraulic fluid, under high pressure, sprayed throughout the cockpit, coating the inside of the windscreen and Johnson's goggles. The fluid was not flammable, but it effectively blinded him. He could see nothing but an oily smear where his windscreen had been. The most catastrophic damage was to the flight controls and engine. Multiple cannon shells had struck the engine cowling and cylinder heads. The P-47's radial engine, normally so reliable, began to run rough, missing on damaged cylinders. The control cables, though armored, had been damaged by the hail of fire. Johnson's stick felt mushy, the aircraft responding sluggishly to his inputs. And then the Thunderbolt snapped into a spin. A flat spin is among the most dangerous situations a pilot can face. The aircraft rotates around its vertical axis while descending, the wings stalled, the controls largely ineffective. Recovery requires precise technique and immediate action. Johnson, barely conscious from the shock of the attack and the sudden onset of hypoxia from his shattered canopy, had only seconds to react. His training took over. He pushed the stick forward to break the stall, then stomped on the left rudder pedal with all his strength, fighting to stop the rotation. The Thunderbolt, heavy and built like a truck, responded with agonizing slowness. The spin slowed, but did not stop. Johnson could feel the G-forces increasing as the aircraft's rotation converted into a spiral dive. He was descending rapidly, the altimeter unwinding at a terrifying rate. He pulled back on the stick, trying to level the aircraft, but the nose remained low. The engine, damaged and running rough, still produced power, but not enough to climb. Fire, which had erupted during the initial attack, licked at the edges of his vision. And then, miraculously, the fire went out. Whether it was starved of fuel, blown out by the rush of air through the damaged fuselage, or extinguished by some other mechanism, Johnson never knew. What mattered was that the flames disappeared, taking with them the immediate threat of an explosion. His aircraft was still flying, barely, but flying nonetheless. Johnson managed to level the Thunderbolt at approximately 1,000 feet above the English Channel. He was below the main combat, separated from his squadron, alone over enemy-controlled waters. His engine was damaged but running. His controls worked, though poorly. His hydraulic system was destroyed, meaning his landing gear would have to be manually lowered if he survived long enough to attempt a landing. His canopy was jammed partially open, the frame bent by battle damage. Most critically, he could not see. Hydraulic fluid covered his windscreen and goggles. When he tried to wipe it away, it simply smeared, making visibility worse. He tried to open the canopy fully so he could bail out. His parachute was intact, and if he could get clear of the aircraft, he had a chance of being rescued from the channel. The Royal Air Force and U.S. Army Air Forces maintained air-sea rescue services with boats and aircraft specifically designed to retrieve downed pilots. But the canopy would not move. It had jammed after opening approximately 6 inches, held in place by bent metal and damaged tracks. No amount of force could make it budge further. In desperation, Johnson tried to squeeze through the narrow opening. If he could get his head and shoulders through, perhaps he could wriggle free and jump. He unfastened his seat harness and pushed himself upward. The opening was too small. Worse, his parachute pack snagged on the canopy frame. He was stuck, half in and half out of the cockpit, with his aircraft flying itself in an uncontrolled descent toward the channel waters. With tremendous effort, Johnson pulled himself back into the seat and refastened his harness. He was trapped in a flying coffin, unable to see, unable to bail out, flying an aircraft that could fail catastrophically at any moment. His only choice was to try to reach England, somehow maintain control, and attempt a landing despite having no forward visibility and no functioning instruments. The odds of success seemed impossibly small. But staying in the aircraft offered a chance, however slim. Bailing out into the channel, even with a working parachute, carried its own risks. Survival time in the cold water was measured in hours at best. Johnson made the decision to stay with his aircraft, and tried to coax it home. He set course for England, navigating by instinct and the sun's position when he could see it through breaks in the oil-smeared windscreen. The Thunderbolt, though badly damaged, maintained altitude and speed. The R-2800 engine continued to turn, its damaged cylinders firing intermittently but producing enough power to keep flying. Johnson settled into a grim routine: check his position through the small patches of clear glass at the edge of his windscreen, make small corrections to his heading, monitor the engine sounds for any indication of imminent failure, and wait. He did not know it, but his ordeal was far from over. Behind him, closing on his wounded aircraft, came a lone Focke-Wulf 190. Robert Johnson first became aware of the Focke-Wulf when he glimpsed it through a clear section at the edge of his oil-smeared windscreen. The fighter was perhaps 200 yards behind him, closing slowly but deliberately. Johnson's heart sank. He was defenseless. His 8 machine guns remained loaded and theoretically functional, but without a working gun sight or the ability to see clearly, he could not effectively aim them. His aircraft's damaged controls made maneuvering difficult. And the Focke-Wulf pilot held every advantage. The German fighter was painted in a striking livery, blue fuselage with a yellow cowling, markings that indicated a veteran pilot of some skill. The aircraft appeared undamaged, its movements smooth and controlled. The pilot was taking his time, examining his wounded prey, perhaps surprised that the Thunderbolt was still flying at all. In the brutal calculus of air combat, this should have been a simple execution. The damaged American fighter presented an easy target, and doctrine called for finishing off crippled opponents before they could potentially recover and return to fight another day. Johnson watched the Focke-Wulf maneuver into a firing position directly astern. He could do nothing but wait and hope. His damaged controls would not respond quickly enough to evade. Even if he could see clearly, there was nowhere to hide. The English Channel stretched empty in all directions. He was perhaps 5 miles from the French coast, still in range of German coastal radar and anti-aircraft defenses if he descended too low. The Focke-Wulf pilot had him perfectly positioned for a killing shot. The German opened fire. But something was wrong. Instead of the devastating 20mm cannon fire that had shredded Johnson's aircraft during the initial attack, the Focke-Wulf was firing machine guns. The sound was different, sharper, more rapid, but without the heavy impacts of exploding cannon shells. Rounds struck Johnson's aircraft along its length, punching holes in the aluminum skin, some ricocheting off with metallic pings, others passing straight through. The Thunderbolt shuddered under the impacts, but continued flying. Johnson realized what had happened. The German had expended his cannon ammunition during the initial ambush. Focke-Wulf 190s typically carried only 250 rounds per cannon, enough for approximately 15 seconds of fire. The high rate of fire and limited ammunition meant that pilots had to fire in short bursts to conserve rounds. During the furious opening engagement, the German pilot had used all his cannon ammunition. Now he had only his machine guns, firing rifle-caliber 7.92mm rounds. These rounds were far less destructive than cannon shells. They could punch holes in aluminum skin and damage systems, but they lacked the explosive force to catastrophically damage the Thunderbolt's heavy structure. Johnson hunched down behind his armor plate, the inch-thick steel that protected the pilot's back and head from rear attacks. The armor, designed for exactly this situation, deflected the machine gun fire. Rounds struck it and ricocheted away. The sound inside the cockpit was deafening, a continuous metallic hammering that made thought difficult and conversation impossible, though Johnson had no one to talk to. In desperation, Johnson tried to fight back. He kicked his rudder pedals left and right, slewing the Thunderbolt's nose in unpredictable motions. This ancient tactic, designed to spoil an attacker's aim, required the defender to maintain enough airspeed to avoid stalling while making coordinated movements of rudder and ailerons. Johnson's damaged controls made this difficult, but he managed to induce enough motion to throw off the German's aim slightly. When the Focke-Wulf pilot maneuvered ahead to reset his attack, Johnson pressed his gun trigger. His 8 machine guns erupted, sending a stream of tracers toward the enemy fighter. He could not aim properly, could barely see through his oil-covered windscreen, but he wanted the German to know he was still fighting. The Focke-Wulf easily evaded the poorly aimed fire, banking smoothly away before circling back for another attack run. The second pass was more deliberate. The German pilot had assessed the situation and understood his opponent's limitations. The Thunderbolt was too damaged to maneuver effectively. The American pilot was either wounded or unable to see, judging by the erratic nature of his return fire. This should be straightforward. The German positioned himself carefully and opened fire again. Once more, machine gun rounds hammered into Johnson's aircraft. The fuselage took dozens of hits. Rounds struck the engine cowling, the wings, the tail surfaces. Some penetrated into the cockpit area, and Johnson felt at least one round pass uncomfortably close to his leg. The armor plate behind his seat continued to do its job, deflecting the rounds that would have struck him in the back or head. The Thunderbolt's robust construction absorbed the punishment. Control cables, though hit multiple times, continued to function. The engine, despite taking additional damage, kept running. The German pilot pulled alongside after this pass, flying in formation with Johnson at a distance of perhaps 50 feet. Johnson could see him clearly through the side of his shattered canopy. The pilot appeared to be examining the Thunderbolt, looking it over from nose to tail, perhaps counting the damage, perhaps trying to understand how the aircraft was still flying. He shook his head in what might have been disbelief or respect. Then the Focke-Wulf dropped back and positioned for a third attack. Johnson braced himself. He knew that each pass increased the probability of a catastrophic hit. A lucky round through the wrong component could sever a critical control cable, puncture a fuel line, or damage the engine beyond its ability to continue running. He was living on borrowed time, and he knew it. All he could do was huddle behind his armor plate, grip his control stick, and endure. The third pass brought another sustained burst of machine gun fire. The sound in the cockpit was overwhelming, a continuous rattling that seemed to go on forever. Johnson lost count of the impacts. Later, when ground crews examined his aircraft, they would stop counting at 200 holes without completing their survey of the entire airframe. The majority were small-caliber machine gun holes, but mixed among them were larger holes from the cannon fire during the initial attack. It was a testament to the Thunderbolt's construction that so much of its structure could be perforated and still maintain structural integrity. After the third pass, something changed. The Focke-Wulf did not circle back for another attack. Instead, it pulled alongside Johnson's Thunderbolt again, flying in close formation. The German pilot looked across the narrow space between the two aircraft. For a long moment, the two men, enemies in a brutal war, made eye contact. What passed between them in that moment can only be imagined. Recognition of shared humanity? Respect for an opponent who refused to die? Acknowledgement of the Thunderbolt's incredible toughness? The German pilot raised his hand in a salute. It was a gesture from an earlier era of warfare, when enemies could respect each other even as they tried to kill each other. Then he rocked his wings, a traditional aviator's farewell, and turned away, pointing his Focke-Wulf back toward France. Johnson watched him go, hardly believing what he had witnessed. The German had given up the pursuit. Whether he had run out of ammunition for his machine guns as well, or whether he had simply decided that no aircraft could survive what he had done and would inevitably crash, Johnson never learned. What mattered was that the attack was over. He was alone again, still flying, still heading for England. The identity of the German pilot has been the subject of speculation and debate for decades. Many accounts have claimed it was Egon Meyer, a Luftwaffe ace who would eventually be credited with 102 victories before his death in March 1944. The story of Meyer showing mercy to Johnson became part of aviation legend. However, historical research has cast doubt on this identification. Meyer's unit was stationed in Brittany that day, too far from the combat area to be involved. German records show no claims by Meyer on June 26, 1943. Other pilots from Jägerschwader 26 were definitely present in the engagement, but the specific identity of Johnson's assailant remains unknown. What is certain is that the German pilot had multiple opportunities to destroy Johnson's aircraft, and chose to break off the attack. Whether this was tactical calculation, respect for an opponent, or simple exhaustion of ammunition, the result was the same. Johnson had survived an encounter that should have killed him. Now he faced the challenge of getting home. The English coast appeared ahead, a welcome sight that brought a surge of hope. But Johnson's problems were far from over. He still could not see properly. His landing gear was inoperative. His engine was running on borrowed time. And he would need to find an airfield, identify it through his oil-smeared windscreen, and somehow put his crippled fighter on the ground without killing himself. Johnson knew that attempting a wheels-up landing with no forward visibility was suicidal. The Thunderbolt would hit the ground at over 100 miles per hour and tumble across the field in a shower of sparks and torn metal. His best chance was to find an airfield with a long runway, declare an emergency, and hope that he could manually lower his landing gear using the emergency system. Even then, he would be landing essentially blind, guided only by glimpses through the edges of his windscreen and instructions from the control tower. He crossed the English coast near Dover and turned northwest, heading for RAF Manston. He knew the field well, having departed from there only hours earlier. It had long runways and crash rescue equipment. If he could find it, if he could get his landing gear down, if his engine held together for a few more minutes, he might survive. The tower at Manston saw him coming. His erratic flight path and obvious damage had attracted attention. The tower controllers cleared all other traffic and prepared emergency crews. They watched as the battered Thunderbolt approached, trailing smoke, yawing from side to side, flying like a drunk man walking home. When Johnson tried to lower his landing gear using the manual hand crank, the system refused to cooperate. The hydraulic damage had bent components out of alignment. He cranked desperately, but the gear would not lock. He made the decision to go around and try again. He pushed his throttle forward, and the damaged engine responded with a surge of power. He climbed away from the field, circled awkwardly, and tried the hand crank again. This time, through some combination of persistence and luck, the main gear locked into position. The tailwheel remained stuck, but two wheels were better than none. Johnson set up for his final approach, lining up with the runway by peering through the side of his canopy. He could barely see forward. His approach angle was too steep, his speed too high. He came in hot and hard, touching down with a jarring impact that would have collapsed the landing gear of a lesser aircraft. The Thunderbolt's heavy-duty gear absorbed the shock. The aircraft bounced once, settled back on the runway, and rolled to a stop as Johnson shut down the engine. Emergency crews surrounded the aircraft immediately. They helped Johnson out of the cockpit, noting his bloodied face, his hydraulic fluid-soaked flight suit, and the distant look in his eyes. He had been in combat for what felt like hours but was perhaps 45 minutes from the initial attack to his landing. In that time, he had been shot down, recovered from a spin, survived multiple attacks, and brought his crippled aircraft home across the channel. When the ground crews examined his Thunderbolt, they were stunned. The aircraft had over 200 holes in it. Critical components were hanging by threads. The fact that it had flown at all, much less carry Johnson safely home, seemed impossible. Robert Johnson did not return to combat for several days after his ordeal on June 26, 1943. The physical injuries were relatively minor: a grazed nose, cuts from canopy fragments, bruising from the impacts and G-forces. The psychological impact was more profound. He had confronted his own mortality in the most immediate way possible, trapped in a burning aircraft, unable to bail out, certain he was going to die. That he survived at all seemed miraculous. That he survived repeated attacks from a determined opponent seemed impossible. His squadron mates gathered around to hear his story. They examined the wreckage of his Thunderbolt with something approaching awe. The ground crew chief who inspected the aircraft told Johnson flatly that it should not have flown, that by all rights it should be scattered in pieces across France. When they began counting the bullet and cannon holes, they stopped after documenting 200 separate impacts. They estimated the true total might be closer to 300. The aircraft was written off as beyond economical repair, too damaged to restore to service. The story of Johnson's survival spread rapidly through the 8th Air Force. Pilots who flew other fighter types, particularly the P-38 Lightning and later the P-51 Mustang, heard about the Thunderbolt that had taken a beating from 11 German fighters and lived to tell the tale. The number 11 comes from Johnson's own account, which mentioned multiple attackers during the initial ambush, though records indicate 16 Focke-Wulf 190s were involved in the overall engagement. Regardless of the exact count, the central fact remained: Johnson had survived an encounter that would have destroyed most aircraft. The incident became a powerful recruiting tool for the P-47. Republic Aviation's engineers and test pilots had designed the aircraft to be tough, but even they were surprised by the punishment it could absorb. The armor plating, the self-sealing fuel tanks, the radial engine, the robust airframe, all of these features had worked exactly as intended. The Thunderbolt's reputation as a survivor was established. Pilots who might have preferred the sleek lines of a Mustang or the twin-engine power of a Lightning began to reconsider. There was something to be said for flying an aircraft that could bring you home even after taking a horrific beating. Johnson returned to combat and continued to add to his score. By the time his tour ended in May 1944, he had been officially credited with 27 aerial victories, making him one of the leading American aces of the European theater. He never forgot the lesson of June 26, 1943, that survival sometimes mattered more than victory, that bringing yourself and your aircraft home was a success worth celebrating. His aggressiveness in combat remained, but it was tempered by the knowledge that overconfidence could be fatal. The identity of the German pilot who attacked Johnson's crippled Thunderbolt remained a subject of speculation for decades. The story that it was Egon Mayer became widely accepted, appearing in books, documentaries, and official histories. Mayer was a perfect candidate for the role, a highly skilled ace known for his tactical brilliance, and, according to some accounts, his chivalrous attitude toward defeated opponents. The image of Mayer saluting Johnson and flying away fit neatly into the narrative of honorable combat between professional warriors. But careful historical research has undermined this identification. Mayer's unit was not in the combat area on June 26, 1943. German records contain no claims by Mayer for that date. While it remains possible that Mayer was somehow involved in an engagement that went unrecorded, the weight of evidence suggests otherwise. The actual identity of the pilot remains unknown, one of thousands of individual encounters during the war that were not fully documented by either side. What is documented is the broader context of the air war in 1943. The 8th Air Force was still learning how to conduct daylight strategic bombing against a determined and skilled opponent. The losses were severe. Throughout 1943, American bomber crews faced the terrifying reality that each mission might be their last. German fighters attacked in waves, exploiting weaknesses in defensive formations, targeting damaged stragglers, showing no mercy. The need for long-range escort fighters was desperate. The P-47 Thunderbolt, despite its initial limitations in range and rate of climb, proved invaluable in this brutal environment. Its ability to absorb damage and keep flying saved countless pilots' lives. As the war progressed and drop tanks extended its range, the Thunderbolt accompanied bombers deeper into Germany. When the P-51 Mustang arrived with superior range and high-altitude performance, the Thunderbolt transitioned to fighter-bomber missions, where its ruggedness and heavy bomb load made it ideal for ground attack. Republic Aviation would eventually produce more than 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts in various models. The aircraft served in every theater of the war: Europe, the Mediterranean, the Pacific, the China-Burma-India theater. It proved adaptable to every role: air superiority fighter, bomber escort, fighter-bomber, close air support, long-range reconnaissance. Soviet pilots received Thunderbolts through Lend-Lease and used them on the Eastern Front. Brazilian squadrons flew them in Italy. Free French pilots flew them over their liberated homeland. But the aircraft's most enduring legacy was its reputation for bringing pilots home. Stories like Robert Johnson's survival became part of Thunderbolt lore. There were others, pilots who flew home with engines shot out, with wings perforated, with tail sections nearly severed. One pilot landed successfully despite having a German fighter's wing embedded in his Thunderbolt's fuselage after a collision. Another made it back to base with most of his rudder shot away. Time and again, the aircraft demonstrated that it could absorb damage that would destroy other fighters and still fly. This quality had implications beyond individual survival. Pilots who flew the Thunderbolt could press attacks more aggressively, knowing their aircraft would likely survive hits that would doom a lighter fighter. They could stay in the fight longer, take more risks, and accomplish missions that might be too dangerous in more fragile aircraft. The psychological confidence this provided was as valuable as any technical specification. Robert Johnson's damaged aircraft, too far gone to repair, was stripped for usable parts, and the rest scrapped. No effort was made to preserve it as a historical artifact. In 1943, with the war's outcomes still uncertain and production lines running at capacity, sentiment took a back seat to practical necessity. Thousands of combat-damaged aircraft met the same fate. Only later, after the war ended and historians began to piece together the individual stories of courage and survival, did people realize what had been lost. Johnson himself survived the war and returned to the United States. He left active duty but remained in the Air Force Reserve, eventually retiring with the rank of colonel. He worked in the aviation industry, married, raised a family, and lived a quiet life far from the headlines that had briefly made him famous. He rarely spoke publicly about his combat experiences, uncomfortable with the attention and celebrity that sometimes attached to wartime heroism. In his later years, Johnson wrote an autobiography titled Thunderbolt, with collaborator Martin Kaiden. The book, published in 1958, provided a detailed account of his combat career, including the events of June 26, 1943. It became a classic of aviation literature, praised for its honest depiction of air combat and the psychological pressures faced by fighter pilots. Johnson's writing revealed a thoughtful man who understood that luck had played as large a role in his survival as skill or courage. The broader lessons of Johnson's survival extended beyond aviation. His story became a case study in the importance of engineering robustness into military systems. The Thunderbolt's designers had prioritized pilot protection and structural integrity over performance metrics like top speed or maneuverability. This philosophy, sometimes criticized by pilots who wanted a more agile fighter, proved its worth in the unforgiving crucible of combat. It influenced subsequent fighter designs, particularly ground attack aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt II, which inherited the P-47's name and design philosophy. The incident also illustrated the unpredictable nature of combat. No amount of training or planning could have prepared Johnson for the specific circumstances he faced. The jammed canopy, the hydraulic fluid obscuring his vision, the extended chase by a single determined opponent, each element was unique to his situation. What saved him was a combination of his aircraft's design, his own determination, and factors beyond anyone's control. In war, as in life, outcomes often depend on variables that cannot be predicted or controlled. The moral dimension of the German pilot's decision to break off his attack remains ambiguous. Was it mercy? Combat pragmatism? Respect for an opponent? The pilot himself never came forward to tell his side of the story. Tens of thousands of Luftwaffe personnel died during the war, and many records were lost or destroyed. The pilot might have been killed in subsequent combat. He might have survived but chosen to remain silent, uncomfortable discussing his wartime service. Or he might never have realized that his opponent survived to tell the tale. What can be said with certainty is that his decision, whatever motivated it, allowed Robert Johnson to live and fight another day. It allowed Johnson to eventually return home, to marry, to have children, to live a full life. In the calculus of war, where death is common and survival remarkable, this single act of restraint, or exhaustion, or respect, made all the difference. Robert Johnson died in December 1998 at the age of 78. His obituaries recounted his 27 aerial victories and his status as one of America's leading World War II aces. But for those who knew the stories behind the numbers, his greatest achievement was not the aircraft he shot down but the aircraft he brought home. On June 26, 1943, facing impossible odds in a crippled fighter, he demonstrated qualities that transcend military skill, resilience, determination, and an unwillingness to surrender in the face of overwhelming adversity. The P-47 Thunderbolt that carried him through that ordeal is gone, scrapped long ago for its aluminum and steel. But the story endures, passed down through generations of aviators as a reminder of what both human beings and their machines can endure when tested to their limits. It stands as testament to the engineers who built the Thunderbolt tough enough to absorb punishment that would destroy other aircraft. It honors the pilot who refused to give up even when trapped in what should have been a flying coffin. And it acknowledges, with questions that can never be fully answered, the enemy pilot who made a choice that allowed his opponent to survive. In the vast and impersonal machinery of the Second World War, where millions died and entire cities were reduced to rubble, individual stories like Johnson's serve as reminders that war is ultimately experienced by individual human beings. Behind every statistic, every battle report, every victory claim, were men who felt fear, experienced pain, made split-second decisions, and lived or died based on factors both within and beyond their control. Robert Johnson's survival on June 26, 1943, was both typical and extraordinary. Typical in that it involved courage and luck in roughly equal measure, extraordinary in that the details were so dramatic and the outcome so improbable. The sky over the English Channel on that June afternoon witnessed an encounter between enemies that became a story of survival, respect, and the limits of human endurance. 11 German fighters, or 16, depending on how one counts the engagement, failed to stop one P-47 Thunderbolt. The aircraft was nearly destroyed, its pilot wounded and barely conscious, but it flew on. And in that continued flight, despite every reason to fall, lies a truth about both engineering excellence and human determination that resonates far beyond the specific circumstances of a long-ago air battle.